Sometimes it gets ahead of itself. We are continuing our study of the book of Job, and we will be beginning tonight in chapter 14. A little bit of review to catch us up with where we are. In chapter 11, Zophar is the third of the friends who has answered Job. Job gives his complaint to these men and extols God, and yet says he does not understand what is going on, why he is being punished the way that he is, and his friends believe that they have the answers to his questions, that he has committed sin, obviously, because God punishes the sinful and not the sinless. And so Job is suffering for what he has done, something that he has done, and what he needs to do is confess that sin, and God will forgive him of that sin and restore to him his good favor upon him. In chapter 11, Zophar has answered Job in verses 1 through 6 by saying he believes that Job deserves a very blunt and harsh response to the complaining that he is making. He can't believe that somebody would actually say the things that Job has said. In verses 7 through 12, Zophar extols God's limitless power and his wisdom, with the idea that whatever is happening to Job, it is the power of God that has come upon him, and it is based on God's perfect wisdom. This is what God is doing because this is what Job, for some reason, deserved. Job has sinned, and he deserves what God has brought upon him. In verses 13 through 20, he repeats that Job's misery will end when Job's stubbornness ends. Job, you're just being stubborn, and God is punishing you. He's even increasing the punishment because of your stubborn will. And the fact of the matter, Zophar says, is God hasn't punished you near as much as your sinfulness has deserved. Job spends 3 chapters in the book answering Zophar. And it is up until the very last speech that Job gives, it is the longest of his answers to these men. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, he opens with a scornful rebuke of these men. It's getting pretty hot and heavy between these two groups. Scorn is piled upon scorn. Harsh language piled upon harsh language. And he accuses them of thinking themselves to be wiser than what they really are. In verses 13 through 25, there is yet another ode to the wisdom and the power of God. Job needs to realize who it is that he is, or Zophar rather, needs to realize just who it is that he is speaking of here when he speaks about God. He needs to be cautious, Job says, when he speaks of God bringing destruction on people and those kinds of things. When he's trying to explain God to people, he needs to be cautious because of God's great power and God's great wisdom. And then in verses 20, or chapter 13, verses 1 through 19, God's wisdom is perfect, while his friend's wisdom is deeply flawed. So again, there would be the idea of being careful. Being careful about what you say about God, being careful about what you boast about yourself. And just because someone understands things about God, that doesn't mean that they understand God. Just because they understand some of the ways that God works, that doesn't mean they have the answer, every answer to every problem that they come across. And so God's wisdom is perfect, their wisdom is not. In verses 20 through 28, Job turns his attention from his three friends, and again he addresses God directly. And he makes two requests there in chapter 13. The two requests are that he says, "Do not continue to afflict me and cause me to be afraid of you." And so he asks for an end to this affliction that he knows that God has brought upon him. He doesn't want to face God with this terror of God because of what he is going through. And then after God has ended the affliction, the second request is, allow me to have a dialogue with you. I need to speak to you, God, about this situation. I need to understand from you what it is that is going on in this situation. And then two questions for God. One, why have I become your enemy? And two, will you continue to crush me like a dry leaf or a fragile, dry stubble? He sees himself as nothing more than a dry leaf that you could just crush with very little effort with your hand. He says, that's what I am, and for some reason I am in your crushing hand, and you are crushing me. And he makes that point in verse 28 that he's going to open chapter 14 and kind of spread out that argument. He says, man decays like a rotting thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten. I think what Job is doing there is he is recognizing the course that life takes. Life begins with strength and power and agility and the body is this fine-tuned machine. But man, from the moment he is born, Job sees him as decaying. That is the way of life. And it doesn't take very long to be able to see, the youth, the power, the strength, the agility that you had when you were a teenager fades in your 20s and your 30s and then more in your 40s. And you start getting into your 50s and your 60s and your 70s and your 80s, and you see that decay continuing. You become weaker. Your mind doesn't work as well. Your eyes aren't as sharp. Those kinds of things. And so he says that is the way of life. Man decays, just like something, a piece of fruit that's thrown out in the yard. It's going to decay rapidly. He says that's a more rapid picture, but it is a picture of what happens over time with man. And so continuing that thought and expanding on it as we begin chapter 14, Job says, man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. That's one of the well-known statements that comes out of the book of Job. As Job contemplates this downward progression of man. And relatively speaking, man is a few days. If you take the age of this world and the age of a lot of things in this world, man is just here for a moment and then he is gone. And so he's born of a woman. He spends a few days here, and he says those days are full of trouble. Job is speaking from the viewpoint of a man who is going through a full dose of that trouble. And I'm sure this falling into rottenness that man goes through is very keen to Job at this time, because he is seeing rapidly his body fall to pieces. And he says in verse 2, he comes forth like a flower and he fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. Just as a flower appears just kind of momentarily, and then, it's gone just in maybe days, or maybe some flowers might last a week, others might last a month or two, but very rapidly the flower fades away. And he says that's also a picture of man. He's just here one moment and he's gone the next. And between the time of his arrival and the time of his departure, there's just plenty of trouble that comes into his life. In verses 3 through 6, another thing that Job has focused on, and that is that God is continuing to be silent. And Job sees no way for this suffering to help him outside of God explaining to him why it is that he is suffering. He says in verse 3, "And do you open your eyes on such a one and bring me to judgment with yourself? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? No one. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you. You have appointed his limits so that he cannot pass. Look away from him that he may rest, till like a hired man he finishes his day." And so Job sees this span of a man's life. It's kind of in the hands of God. And the part of this course kind of that has been directed by God, the way that Job's life is going to go, is this time of suffering that he is going through. How can suffering help Job if he has no idea why it is that he is suffering? And that is why he pleads time after time after time, "God, please tell me why it is that you have seen fit to afflict me as you have." And he notes there in verse 5 that God has determined the number of man's days. And I like that you have appointed his limit so that he cannot pass. You remember who in the New Testament said something very much like that in explaining God to a group of people who he was introducing God to? Paul said it in Athens in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26. God determines the boundaries of man's habitation. I think that's exactly what Paul, or what Job is saying here in this passage. God controls everything. He controls the length of life. He controls the quality of life. Job understands that all the good things that he had when he was the greatest of the men of the East, those things he enjoyed because God had given him those things to enjoy. And so now when he is suffering as he is, it is because God has directed that. That is the course that God has appointed for him. Verse 6 is another one of those pleas that God would just ignore him. That God, rather than kind of directing the way things are going, that God would just totally forget about Job and just let him rest. Stop the affliction. Let me rest until that time comes when my life is over. In verses 7 through 12, I like the comparison that he makes here in this passage as he compares a man's life to a tree. He says, "For there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and that its tender shoots will not cease. Though its root may grow old in the earth, and its stump may die in the ground, yet at the scent of water it will bud and bring forth branches like a plant." We're familiar with what he is describing here. You cut down a tree and you think, man, I've gotten rid of that thing, and then all of a sudden here it is sprouting. I had a Bradford pear tree, which does not produce pears. I don't know why they call it a pear tree, but it is. They're quick growing, and that's why they plant them in all these new yards in these new houses, because they'll grow to maturity quicker than pretty much any other tree that you can plant. But they're weak. Any tree that grows fast is going to be a weak tree. And I had one in my yard, and about half of it fell off. Fortunately, it fell away from the house. So I went ahead and had the thing cut down before the other half could fall the other way and land on the house. And so we had it cut off at the stump, had somebody come out and grind that stump up, and we were finished with that tree. Except for about a year, we were pulling little trees up that were growing from the roots under the ground of that Bradford pear tree. Hard to kill, totally kill a tree. And that's what he's saying here. That you can cut a tree down and you can think you have it dead, but all of a sudden it'll start sprouting little trees. Well, what about a man? Verse 10, "But man dies and is laid away. Indeed, he breathes his last. And where is he? As water disappears from the sea and a river becomes parched and dries up, so man lies down and does not rise till the heavens are no more. They shall not awake nor be aroused from their sleep." He says, man's not like that. Man doesn't leave a stump. You don't water a grave and a person rises up from it. When a man is dead, it's over. When it's over, it's over for a man in the physical existence. And you read that, what he says there about man lying down, never to rise again. He is not denying the resurrection of the dead. What he is talking about is the course of earthly existence. He says the course of earthly existence is when a person dies, that is the end of their life on earth. They're not going to branch out and sprout leaves and live again on this earth. He dies, he's laid away, he breathes no more, and he says that does not, the breath does not return till the heavens are no more. As far as life on earth is concerned, that's the way that life goes. Now, he's going to talk about the resurrection of the dead, but that is not, the spiritual life is not his consideration at this point. Anything through verse 12 of chapter 14. Yes, sir, Don.
Something scares me about this chapter, and where he says it seems better to Job that God would just look away from him. That's a serious thing to say. Look away from me, God. And what do we need? We need God.
Yeah.
And, he started off the book by even rebuking his wife. I'm not going to curse God and die. And now through all of this suffering, he's getting to the point where he just wants God to look away from him.
Yeah. Just leave me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's scary.
Isn't it? And what that says is that Job sees not one single benefit of God being with him at this point. You talk about people, they go through all of these difficulties, and you say, well, at least you still got your life. Job is saying, I don't want my life. I don't want to continue to live. I want this to be over. I want to rest. And the only way that he can do that, he sees if God will leave him alone, walk away from him, and let him just finish his life. It is a very depressing thing. And he's in a very depressed place in his life. Yes, sir.
He's tying back to verse 3 and connecting 3 and 6. And even in this chapter, he's about to hit some hopeful stuff. Like he's vacillating back and forth, even in this chapter. But in verse 3, he sees God as this God that is constantly watching in a judgmental way. Like his concept of God is this prosecuting attorney that's just trying to jump people. And if that's the way God is, verse 6, look away from us for a while and just leave us alone. Like this isn't fair. And he's starting to have this moment of depression and reaching wrong conclusions about the nature of God. And in just a couple of verses, he swings back the other way, where he asks for renewal and other things. So he hasn't landed yet, but he's hurting so badly. He's reaching some wrong ideas about God.
Yeah, and he is kind of made that statement, but in question form in
Yes.
chapter 10.
Yeah.
Are you going to be like a man who has it in for me, and you're going to watch every little thing I do until you can catch me at something? That's kind of his question in chapter 10. And I think you're right. He returns to that in verse 3 and in this section here. I want you to just walk away from me, and that is a very depressing place for a person to be. Okay, man lies down, he does not rise. And so, if God is over everything, and when it's over, then, oh, that you would hide me in the grave. Again, he sees death as a blessing. And we look at death with dread, and no doubt before he went through this, Job would have had a certain dread to death, of death, but he sees it as a friend. As we go on, he's gonna talk about the grave being home, and the worms eating him being his sister. Death is like going home, and the grave is like your father, and the worms eating you and your body decaying is like your mother and your sister. He longs for it, like the person away from home longs to be home. Oh, that you would hide me in the grave, that you would conceal me until your wrath is past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my hard service I will wait till my change comes. Okay, so his point in this is that if God controls everything and God has brought this upon him, then please God, let me cease to live. Let me hide in the grave. In the grave I will find perhaps some measure of rest, although I think he does understand, this is going to come out a little better later on, he does understand in his mind, death, it's not the grave that is the true hope. It is the resurrection from the grave that is going to be his true hope. But for now, he prefers whatever it is that happens to him in death, the decay and the worm eating and all of that goes on in death. He prefers that to the life that he is living. But he does, notice there in the last part of verse 13, he does have hope of the resurrection. You know, did those people in the Old Testament, did they have a concept of the resurrection of the dead? They seem to in Job's time. They seem to understand that the grave was not intended to be the end of man. That one day God would call them out of the grave. He would remember them and bring them forth. And so that is his desire. Verse 14, if a man dies, shall he live again? All the days of my hard service I will wait till my change comes. What's the answer to that? If a man dies, will he live again? Absolutely, he will. If the righteous man dies, he will live again to eternal reward. If the unrighteous man, the wicked man dies, he will raise to eternal condemnation. Job's desire is to live again because his confidence is in whatever is going on with him, whatever reason God has for doing this to him. Job, I think, sees that in the resurrection, everything is going to be worked out. God will proclaim him righteous in the resurrection. Did I see a hand? Yes, sir.
I think we see some of this attitude based on the difficulties of this life in the Apostle Paul, as he writes to the Corinthians, I think it is. And he says, for me to live is better, but to die is gain. And we've seen that, I've seen that in family members as they approach death because of physical things. It's just, why won't God let me die?
Yeah.
It's the same kind of attitude.
Yeah. But both of my parents asked that question. And you get to a certain age and a certain decay of life, and you're going to ask that question. Why am I still here? Why does God not take me home? And that, I think that is the question of the hour for Job here. And again, whatever it is that's in God's mind right now, he's not planning on rising to a life sitting in ashes and scraping boils off his skin. He understands that change is coming. When he is resurrected from the dead, there will be change. All the days of my hard service, I will wait till my change comes. Things are going to be different when I experience the resurrection of the dead. Man, that is the importance of keeping in your mind at all times the resurrection, the second coming of Christ, of remembering that this life is not the important thing. It is the life that is to come. And whatever it is that we may go through in this life that we don't understand why God would have us go through those things, we can go to the grave not understanding, but full of hope, knowing that if we are right before God, if we maintain our integrity before Him, we will rise not like we have been laid to rest. And that's 1 Corinthians 15. Yes, sir.
Just in the context, that word change in verse 14 or renewal is the same word back in verse 7 about the tree. It will sprout again. And so he's rhetorically changing his mind about all that.
Yeah.
When he's like, yeah, it will happen.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Not going to happen on this side, but on the other side. After I have been laid to rest, after I have waited, God's not going to forget me there in the ground. Where did we get? Verse 15, you shall call and I will answer you. You shall desire the work of your hands. God's desire, he says, is for me. For now you number my steps, but do not watch over my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and you cover my iniquity. He is suffering until that time comes when he is laid to rest. He must suffer. And the reason for that, and the idea of his transgression sealed up in a bag and his iniquity covered, the point there is that only God knows. The reason for his suffering is in God's mind and nowhere else. Yes, sir.
It's as if they understand the concept of Christ, though, because of, you would cover my iniquities, you would cover, his transgressions are sealed up in a bag, and they would be covered by God.
Yeah, I don't think he's talking here about the sealing them up and covering them in terms of forgiveness. I think what he's saying here is evidently the sin that I have committed that has brought this upon me, God will not reveal it to me. I may be wrong on that. I think there were some commentators that took that position as well. That at his resurrection, things will go well because whatever sin he has committed, God will have covered. Certainly not a full understanding of the atonement of Jesus Christ, but if he had this idea of his resurrection to a different kind of life, to a blessed life, then he would certainly have had an understanding of God atoning for sin. Yes, sir. Anybody else? Okay, verses 16 through 22, for now you number my steps, but do not watch over my sin. My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and you cover my iniquity. But as a mountain falls and crumbles away, and as a rock is moved from its place, as water wears away stones, and as torrents wash away the soil of the earth, so you destroy the hope of man. I think what he's saying here in this passage, and the further you get into this, the more questions come up about what exactly are Job and his friends saying. And this is one of those situations where there are a number of different thoughts about what is being said here. I believe what Job is describing here is the fading hope that he has of things coming out okay in this life. There is, with his friends, You know, their message is just keep hope alive, man. Repent of your sins, confess them to God, and just be hopeful that God will bring this to an end on this side, and you'll be restored to your place. And I think Job is saying in verses 18 and 19, that ship has sailed. It has, like a mountain, it has crumbled and eroded away. His hope has. Like water, the waters in a river smooth, wash away the stone. So his hope is worn away. He said that's what it is for him. His hope is swiftly being worn away. You prevail forever against him, and he passes on. You change his countenance and send him away. His sons come to honor, and he does not know it. They are brought low, and he does not perceive it. But his flesh will be in pain over it, and his soul will mourn over it. God's judgment prevails, and sinful man is left to just to endure until death comes. That's the way that life works. Man lives a while, man suffers, verse 1, man dies, and man has no knowledge of all that is going on. How is his sons doing? Are they honored? Are they have they been brought low? So he doesn't know, because he is gone. His body is in the ground. His soul has gone to God. In Job's mind, I think verse 22, in Job's mind, death is a painful and mournful existence. Again, Job's hope is not in death, in that decaying body that's in the ground, but in the resurrection that is coming in the after a while. And so we see the misery that Job is going through, but we also see, we see the lack of hope in this life, but the enduring hope of eternal life and eternal well-being. Anybody?
Jerry, I heard a discussion today about how cremation is becoming more and more common. And I was wondering, do you think that cremation is not a Christian thing to do, or that Christians should avoid being cremated, or should prefer burial?
I take a very lenient view on that. What I would say is I cannot see anything that would indicate that cremation is the product of a lack of faith in God, or a lack of desiring to be pleasing to God. While it is true that one of the punishments for wickedness in the Old Testament, one of the threats, was the incineration of the body. I don't think that necessarily means that the incineration of the body is something that has to be exclusive to the wicked. And so my answer to that would be, if you feel like cremation is okay for you, I'm not going to tell you it isn't. And I think it's an individual judgment that a person has to make. What I know is whether it goes to ashes in a fire or it goes to ashes in a coffin, it's going to ashes. It's what's going to be left is ashes and dust. And if God can put together the dust that's in a coffin, He can put together the dust that's in a little box somewhere. So for me, It is just a personal question. And what I would say is, if you don't feel like that it would be right for you to do it, don't do it. What is not done with a good conscience, a Christian needs not to do. You got anything on that?
I would say the same. I mean, God doesn't need a shred of your DNA to resurrect your body. And there are a lot of people that have died for a long time ago that are still going to be raised. So the method of your interment is not something that the Scripture specifies.
Yeah.
So follow your conscience, I think, is
Yeah.
what you said.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody else? Carrie, you got anything? Okay. All right, chapter 15. I'd like to get through chapter 15, but I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, now Eliphaz, this is his second speech. And so, he's pretty rough on the first one, but he's not getting any better on the second one as he answered Job. And again, Job has just poured his heart out, bless his heart. He has tried to get these guys to show some kind of compassion for him. And I'm sure that he thought, 2 chapters worth of complaining about his situation, surely that'll turn one of these guys around. Well, here's how Eliphaz opens up, verse 2. Should a wise man answer with empty knowledge and fill himself with east wind? Should he reason with unprofitable talk or by speeches with which he can do no good? Yes, you cast off fear and restrain prayer before God, for your iniquity teaches your mouth, and you choose the tongue of the crafty. Your own mouth condemns you, and not I. Yes, your own lips testify against you. He's basically turning Job's words against him. Job has accused them of being just a bunch of blowhards. And Eliphaz's answer is right back at you, buddy. You are full of hot air. All of this complaining that you're doing. And there's that proverb, do not answer a man according to his folly. I think that's where Eliphaz kind of finds himself at this point. How am I supposed to answer what you have said without going down into foolish talk like you have? Should a wise man just give up his wisdom and just get down in the dirt with you and get down to your level and answer you? Should he reason with unprofitable talk? It's not doing us any good. Here, this is the 4th attempt we're making, and you're no further along than you were when we started. You don't fear God, and that is restraining your prayers to God. God doesn't hear the prayers of arrogant men, and that's what you are. You talk out of your iniquity. You're speaking craftiness. Everything you're saying is just condemning you. I don't know what Eliphaz has been listening to, but he has not listened very well to Job, because none of that is true of Job. Job is not speaking arrogantly. Job is not speaking foolishly. Job is pouring his heart out to these men. In verse 7, are you the first man who was born? Or were you made before the hills? Have you heard the counsel of God? Do you limit wisdom to yourself? What do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that is not in us? Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, much older than your father. You the oldest guy that ever lived, that you got all this wisdom accumulated? Or has God given you some kind of special revelation that He has given nobody else? And what's that old saying? One finger pointing at you and three are pointing at you and three are pointing back at me. And that's what Eliphaz is finding himself in the situation of. You're an arrogant man. You think you have all of this wisdom. And having all this wisdom is what these guys have been saying all along. We've got the answers to your problem. If you'll just shut up long enough that your ears will open up and you can listen to us, we'll straighten you out on what your problems are. I love that in verse 10. Both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, much older than your father. I do think that probably Eliphaz was the oldest of these men. And I think what he's saying here is, listen here, fella, I'm old enough to be your daddy. And you think you're going to teach me something? And so here's a man who is accusing someone else of being arrogant with the most arrogant speech that he possibly can give. And he cannot see it. And he's going to continue to not see it. Let me get verse 11, because I love this verse. Are the consolations of God too small for you, and the word spoken gently with you? I have written in the margin, wow. Eliphaz believes that what he has spoken are words of consolation for Job. That he and his friends have spoken to Job as gently as they possibly can speak. And I don't know where he went to learn how to counsel the sick. But he needs to go back to school. If he thinks what he has spoken, what his friends have spoken, are consolation and gentleness. They have been harsh against this man. We need to be honest with ourselves in how we answer people. Are we truly, sometimes something that may sound gentle to us doesn't sound very gentle to others. Something that we say thinking that, man, this is consolation. Others may find no consolation in it whatsoever. And so we need to contemplate how what we are going to say to someone is going to be taken and what we mean in what we are saying. We'll finish up there and begin next week in verse 12 of Job chapter 15. Thanks for being here tonight. Byron, will you just